one of the things that we tried to highlight in this was the importance of the centrality. But I just want to, people know who Chertoff is? Does anybody remember Chertoff? I know Imam Zaid. He's a political scientist. Of course he knows who he is. Huh? Did anybody know who Chertoff is, other than Imam Zaid? Remember Chertoff? Who was he? He's the guy that brought in all that Israeli technology into the airports, right? He was the head of Homeland Security, right? Wasn't he? Yeah. Well, his father was Gershon Chertoff, who did his PhD on Imam al-Ghazali. But in it he says, Ghazali's influence began to be felt in the middle of the 12th century. He did not become an authority for the Jews until much later. During the great controversy about the acceptability and the authority of philosophy, all through the 13th and part of the 14th century, none of the contending parties made use of al-Ghazali's name or any of his treatises, even though his ethical work had already been translated during the early period of the struggle. The important works of al-Ghazali were subsequently translated into Hebrew and played an important role in the Jewish literature of the Middle Ages. We shall limit ourselves, however, mainly to the translation of the Maqasid. The Maqasid served for the Jews as a textbook of the peripatetic philosophy, according to the version of Ibn Sina. And al-Ghazali, whatever his own attitude in writing the Maqasid, came to be regarded by the Jews, by the virtue of it, as the chief popularizer of philosophy in the Jewish community. Right? So this is a Jew. This is a Jewish man who got his PhD from Columbia University on Ghazali's influence on the Jewish community based on his philosophy. One of the Ghazali wrote the Maqasid. It's basically based on one of the books of Ibn Sina. He took a book of Ibn Sina and he basically wrote Philosophy for Dummies. Literally, if it was published today, it would be called Philosophy for Dummies. And the scholars actually censured Imam al-Ghazali for doing it because they said he made philosophy accessible to a much larger audience, because Ibn Sina is very abstruse, he's difficult to understand, whereas Ghazali was very clear in his exposition. And so they argued that he's done a grave disservice by writing this book. But what al-Ghazali did, he wrote Maqasid al-Falasifa, which is the aims or the intentions of the philosophers, and he was neutral. He just presented peripatetic philosophy. This is what they say, and all the peripatetics looked at it and said, you've done a marvelous job. Once they said that, okay, in other words, I understand your philosophy. Absolutely, it's a remarkable work of incredible clarity. You've made very difficult thought easy to understand. Then he wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. Now we have imams that have no training in microbiology, and they write books on why evolution is not true. Right? Write a book on evolutionary biology that's recognized by evolutionary biology, and then follow that up with why you don't think. This is part of the problem with our civilization. It's become a very simplistic civilization. Its approach to problems is very simplistic. And this is not to say that everybody should become a metaphysician. On the contrary, there's not a lot of people that can actually do the work. It's difficult work. But if you don't have those people, then you have a major problem, because you lose the intellectual defenders of your faith. You lose the intellectual defender. And then the defense becomes either fanaticism or, even worse, violence, because fanaticism often leads to violence. When you have defenders of the faith, intellectuals, the other thing that you lose is you lose the intelligent members of your community, because they have questions and they don't find answers for those questions. The world is a very troubling place, and if you don't think so, I don't know what planet you're on. But the world is a very troubling place. And to try to understand what the world is, what our place in the world is, to try to understand these things is very difficult. And for some people that are blessed with pure faith, a very simple faith, what Imam al-Razi called Imam al-Ajaiz, the faith of old women. You know, there's a famous story where he was walking with a lot of his students, dozens of them, and an old woman asked one of the students who was the man, and she, don't you know that's Fakhruddin al-Razi? He has 70 proofs for the existence of God. And she said, why would he need 70 proofs? He must have 70 doubts. And when Razi heard that, he said, you should have the faith of old women. You know, that's real faith. And so it's very beautiful, the faith of old women. That's a beautiful faith. You know, we called them, I grew up in the Orthodox Church, the yayas. You know, they were always in the black. And they were the ones, they were always the first ones at church, the last ones to leave. The men usually sat outside smoking cigarettes, waiting for the mass to get over. But those women, and they've kept Islam alive. You know, people like Sayyid Mubin's mother in our region, who's taught so many children the Fatiha. You know, these women that have this incredible, remarkable faith, a deeply rooted faith. But that faith, believe it or not, can easily be lost. Not with that generation, but with the generation that comes from that generation. Because that generation was a generation that grew up in a different time. And so we're losing those people. And that's why it's so important, because when we lose our intellectual foundations, then unfortunately the devotional foundations often follow.